Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the March 2022 edition of Socialism for All. In this video, we're going to be continuing our reading of Blackshirts and Reds, Rational Fascism and the Overthrow of Communism by Michael Parenti from 1997. This is part 3 of that series, which encompasses chapter 4 of the book. Although I generally like to do works in just one video, in this case, the overall book is just too long to really do that, so in the interest of getting it out, I'm breaking it up into 1 or 2 chapter chunks at a time. However, when it's all recorded, I will stitch together the pieces and then upload a full audio video file. Alright, so let's get into chapter 4, Communism in Wonderland. The various communist countries suffered from major systemic deficiencies. While these internal problems were seriously exacerbated by the destruction and military threat imposed by the Western capitalist powers, there were a number of difficulties that seemed to inhere in the system itself. Rewarding inefficiency. All communist nations were burdened by rigid economic command systems. Footnote there, while framed in the past tense, the following discussion also applies to the few remaining communist countries still in existence. Back to the text. Central planning was useful and even necessary in the earlier period of siege socialism to produce steel, wheat, and tanks in order to build an industrial base and withstand the Nazi onslaught. But it eventually hindered technological development and growth and proved incapable of supplying a wide enough range of consumer goods and services. No computerized system could be devised to accurately model a vast and intricate economy. No system could gather and process the immense range of detailed information needed to make correct decisions about millions of production tasks. Top-down planning stifled initiative throughout the system. Stagnation was evident in the failure of the Soviet industrial establishment to apply the innovations of the scientific technological revolution of the 1970s and 1980s, including the use of computer technology. Though the Soviets produced many of the world's best mathematicians, physicists, and other scientists, little of their work found actual application. As Mikhail Gorbachev complained before the 28th Communist Party Congress in 1990, quote, "We can no longer tolerate the managerial system that rejects scientific and technological progress and new technologies, that is committed to cost ineffectiveness and generates squandering and waste." Unquote. It is not enough to denounce ineptitude, one must also try to explain why it persisted, despite repeated exhortations from leaders, going back as far as Stalin himself, who seethed about time-serving bureaucrats. An explanation for the failure of the managerial system may be found in the system itself, which created disincentives for innovation. 1. Managers were little inclined to pursue technological paths that might lead to their own obsolescence. Many of them were not competent in the new technologies and should have been replaced. 2. Managers received no rewards for taking risks. They maintained their positions regardless of whether innovative technology was developed, as was true of their superiors and central planners. 3. Supplies needed for technological change were not readily available. Since inputs were fixed by the plan, and all materials and labor were fully committed, it was difficult to divert resources to innovative production. In addition, experimentation increased the risks of failing to meet one's quotas. 4. There was no incentive to produce better machines for other enterprises, since that brought no rewards to one's own firm. Quite the contrary, under the pressure to get quantitative results, managers often cut corners on quality. 5. There was a scarcity of replacement parts, both for industrial production and for durable use consumer goods. Because top planners set such artificially low prices for spare parts, it was seldom cost-efficient for factories to produce them. 6. Because producers did not pay real value prices for raw materials, fuel, and other things, enterprises often used them inefficiently. 7. Productive capacity was underutilized. Problems of distribution led to excessive unused inventory. Because of irregular shipments, there was a tendency to hoard more than could be put into production, further adding to shortages. 8. Improvements in production would lead only to an increase in one's production quota. In effect, well-run factories were punished with greater workloads. Poor performing ones were rewarded with lower quotas and state subsidies. Managerial irresponsibility was a problem in agriculture as well as industry. One Vietnamese farm organizer's comment could describe the situation in most other communist countries. Quote, "The painful lesson of farm cooperatization was that management was not motivated to succeed or produce." Unquote. If anything, farm management was often motivated to provide a poor product. For instance, since state buyers of meat paid attention to quantity rather than quality, collective farmers maximized profits by producing fatter animals. Consumers might not care to eat fatty meat, but that was their problem. Only a foolish or saintly farmer would work harder to produce better quality meat for the privilege of getting paid less. As in all countries, bureaucracy tended to become a self-feeding animal. Administrative personnel increased at a faster rate than productive workers. A factory with 11,000 production workers might have an administrative staff of 5,000, a considerable burden on productivity. In some enterprises, administrative personnel made up half the full number of workers. The heavily bureaucratic mode of operation did not allow for critical, self-corrective feedback. In general, there was a paucity of the kind of debate that might have held planners and managers accountable to the public. The fate of the whistleblower was the same in communist countries as in our own. Those who exposed waste, incompetence, and corruption were more likely to run risks than receive rewards. Nobody minding the store. We have been taught that people living under communism suffer from, quote, "the totalitarian control over every aspect of life," as Time magazine, May 27, 96, still tells us. Talking to the people themselves, one found that they complained less about overbearing control than about the absence of responsible control. Maintenance people failed to perform needed repairs. Occupants of a new housing project might refuse to pay rent, and no one bothered to collect it. With lax management in harvesting, storage, and transportation, as much as 30% of all produce was lost between field and store, and thousands of tons of meat were left to spoil. People complained about broken toilets, leaky roofs, rude salespeople, poor quality goods, late trains, deficient hospital services, and corrupt and unresponsive bureaucrats. Corruption and favoritism were commonplace. There was the manager who regularly pilfered the till, the workers who filched foodstuffs and goods from state stores or supplies from factories in order to service private homes for personal gain, the peasants on collective farms who stripped parts from tractors to sell them on the black market, the director who accepted bribes to place people at the top of a waiting list to buy cars, and the farmers who hoarded livestock which they sold to townspeople at 3 times the government's low procurement price. All this was hardly the behavior of people trembling under a totalitarian rule of terror. The system itself rewarded evasion and non-compliance. Thus, the poorer the performance of the collective farm, the more substantial the subsidy and the less demanded in the way of work quotas. The poorer the performance of plumbers and mechanics, the less burdened they were with calls and quotas. The poorer the restaurant service, the fewer the number of clients, and the more food left over to take home for oneself or to sell on the black market. The last thing restaurant personnel wanted was satisfied customers who would return to dine at the officially fixed low prices. Not surprisingly, work discipline left much to be desired. There was the clerk who chatted endlessly with a friend on the telephone, while a long line of people waited resentfully for service. The 2 workers who took 3 days to paint a hotel wall that should have taken a few hours. The many who would walk off their jobs to go shopping. Such poor performance itself contributed to low productivity and the cycle of scarcity. In 1979, Cuban leader Raúl Castro offered this list of abuses. Quote, "The lack of work discipline, unjustified absences from work, deliberate go-slows or slowdowns so as not to surpass the norms, which are already low and poorly applied in practice, so that they won't be changed. In contrast to capitalism, when people in the countryside worked an exhausting 12-hour workday and more. There are a good many instances today, especially in agriculture, of people working no more than 4 or 6 hours, with the exception of cane cutters and possibly a few other kinds of work. We know that in many cases, heads of brigades and foremen make a deal with workers to meet the norm in half a day, and then go off and work for the other half in some nearby small private farmer for extra income, or to go slow and meet the norm in 7 or 8 hours, or do 2 or 3 norms in a day and report them over other days on which they don't go to work. All these tricks of the trade in agriculture are also to be found in industry, transportation services, repair shops, and many other places where there's rampant buddyism, cases of you do me a favor and I'll do you one, and pilfering on the side. It's from Cuba Update, March 1980. If fired, an individual had a constitutional guarantee to another job, and seldom had any difficulty finding one. The labor market was a seller's market. Workers did not fear losing their jobs, but managers feared losing their best workers, and sometimes overpaid them to prevent them from leaving. Too often, however, neither monetary rewards nor employment itself were linked to performance. The dedicated employee usually earned no more than the irresponsible one. The slackers and pilferers had a demoralizing effect on those who wanted to work in earnest. Full employment was achieved by padding the workforce with people who had relatively little to do. This added to labor scarcity, low productivity, lack of work discipline, and the failure to implement labor-saving technologies that could maximize production. The communists operated on the assumption that once capitalism and its attendant economic abuses were eliminated, and once social production was communalized, and people were afforded some decent measure of security and prosperity, they would contentedly do their fair share of work. That often proved not so. Communist economies had a kind of Wonderland quality, in that prices seldom bore any relation to actual cost or value. Many expensive services were provided almost entirely free, such as education, medical care, and most recreational, sporting, and cultural events. Housing, transportation, utilities, and basic foods were heavily subsidized. Many people had money, but not much to buy with it. High-priced quality goods and luxury items were hard to come by. All this in turn affected work performance. Why work hard? To earn more when there wasn't that much to buy. Wage increases, designed to attract workers to disagreeable or low-prestige jobs, or as incentives to production, only added to the disparity between purchasing power and the supply of goods. Prices were held artificially low, first out of dedication to egalitarian principles, but also because attempts to readjust them provoked worker protests in Poland, East Germany, and the USSR. Thus, in the Soviet Union and Poland, the state refused to raise the price of bread, which was priced at only a few pennies per loaf, though it cost less than animal feed. One result, farmers in both countries bought the bread to feed their pigs. With rigorous price controls, there was hidden inflation, a large black market, and long shopping lines. Citizens were expected to play by the rules and not take advantage of the system, even when the system inadvertently invited transgressions. They were expected to discard a self-interested mode of behavior when in fact there was no reward and some disadvantage in doing so. The quote, brutal totalitarian regime was actually a giant trough from which many took whatever they could. There was strong resentment concerning consumer scarcities, the endless shopping lines, the 10-year wait for a new automobile, the housing shortage that compelled single people to live at home or get married in order to qualify for an apartment of their own, and the 5-year wait for that apartment. The crowding and financial dependency on parents often led to early divorce. These and other such problems took their toll on people's commitment to socialism. Wanting it all. I listened to an East German friend complain of poor services and inferior products. The system did not work, he concluded. But what of the numerous social benefits so lacking in much of the world, I asked. Aren't these to be valued? His response was revealing. Quote, oh, nobody ever talks about that. Unquote. People took for granted what they had in the way of human services and entitlements, while hungering for the consumer goods dangling in their imaginations. The human capacity for discontent should not be underestimated. People cannot live on the social wage alone. Once our needs are satisfied, then our wants tend to escalate, and our wants become our needs. A rise in living standards often incites a still greater rise in expectations. As people are treated better, they want more of the good things and are not necessarily grateful for what they already have. Leading professionals who had attained relatively good living standards wanted to dress better, travel abroad, and enjoy the more abundant lifestyles available to people of means in the capitalist world. It was this desire for greater affluence, rather than the quest for political freedom, that motivated most of those who emigrated to the West. Material wants were mentioned far more often than the lack of democracy. The émigrés who fled Vietnam in 1989 were not persecuted political dissidents. Usually, they were relatively prosperous craftsmen, small entrepreneurs, well-educated engineers, architects, and intellectuals seeking greater opportunities. To quote one, quote, "I don't think my life here in Vietnam is very bad. In fact, I'm very well off, but that's human nature to always want something better," unquote. Another testified, quote, "We had 2 shops and our income was decent, but we wanted a better life," unquote. And another, quote, "They left for the same reasons we did. They wanted to be richer, just like us," unquote. These are all quotations from the Washington Post, April 12, 1989. Today, a get-rich mania is spreading throughout much of Vietnam as that nation lurches towards a market economy. Likewise, the big demand in the German Democratic Republic, GDR, was for travel, new appliances, and bigger apartments. The New York Times, on March 13, 1990, described East Germany as a, quote, "country of 16 million who seem transfixed by one issue. How soon can they become as prosperous as West Germany?" unquote. A national poll taken in China reported that 68% chose as their goal, quote, "to live well and get rich," according to a PBS TV report, June 96. In 1989, I asked the GDR ambassador in Washington, D.C., why his country made such junky 2-cylinder cars. He said that the goal was to develop good public transportation and discourage the use of costly private vehicles. But when asked to choose between a rational, efficient, economically sound, and ecologically sane mass transportation system, or an automobile with its instant mobility, special status, privacy, and personal empowerment, the East Germans went for the latter, as do most people in the world. The ambassador added ruefully, quote, "We thought that building a good society would make good people. That's not always true," unquote. Whether or not it was a good society, at least he was belatedly recognizing the discrepancy between public ideology and private desire. In Cuba today, many youth see no value in joining the Communist Party and think that Fidel Castro has had his day and should step aside. The revolutionary accomplishments in education and medical care are something they take for granted and cannot get excited about. Generally, they're more concerned about their own personal future than about socialism. University courses on Marxism and courses on the Cuban Revolution, once over-enrolled, now go sparsely attended, while students crowd into classes on global markets and property law. With the U.S. blockade and the loss of Soviet aid, the promise of abundance receded beyond sight in Cuba, and the cornucopia of the North appeared ever more alluring. Many Cuban youth idealize life in the United States and long for its latest styles in music. Like the Eastern Europeans, they think that capitalism will deliver the goodies at no special cost. When told that young people in the United States face serious hurdles, they respond with all the certainty of inexperience. Quote, "We know that many people in the States are poor and that many are rich. If you work hard, however, you can do well. It is the land of opportunity," unquote, per Monthly Review 496. By the second or third generation, relatively few are still alive who can favorably contrast their lives under socialism with the great hardships and injustices of pre-revolutionary days. As stated by one Cuban youth who has no memory of life before the revolution, quote, "We're tired of the slogans. That was all right for our parents, but the revolution is history," quoting San Francisco Chronicle, August 25, 95. In a society of rapidly rising and sometimes unrealistic expectations, those who did not do well, who could not find employment commensurate with their training, or who were stuck with drudge work, were especially inclined to want to change. Even in the best of societies, much labor has an instrumental value but no inherent gratification. The sooner a tedious task is completed, the sooner there is another to be done, so why knock yourself out? If, quote, "building the revolution" and "winning the battle of production" mean performing essential but routine tasks for the rest of one's foreseeable future, the revolution understandably loses its luster. There is often not enough interesting and creative work to go around for all who consider themselves interesting and creative people. In time, the revolution suffers from the routinization of charisma. Ordinary people cannot sustain in everyday life a level of intense dedication for abstract, albeit beautiful, ideals. Why struggle for a better life if it cannot now be attained? And if it can be enjoyed now, then forget about revolutionary sacrifice. Reactionism to the surface. For years, I heard about the devilishly clever manipulations of communist propaganda. Later on, I was surprised to discover that news media in communist countries were usually lackluster and plodding. Western capitalist nations are immersed in an advertising culture with billions spent on marketing and manipulating images. The communist countries had nothing comparable. Their media coverage generally consisted of dull protocol visits and official pronouncements, along with glowing reports about the economy and society, so glowing that people complained about not knowing what was going on in their own country. They could read about abuses of power, industrial accidents, worker protests, and earthquakes occurring in every country but their own. And even when the press exposed domestic abuses, they usually went uncorrected. Media reports sometimes so conflicted with daily experience that the official press was not believed, even when it did tell the truth, as when it reported on poverty and repression in the capitalist world. If anything, many intellectuals in communist nations were utterly starry-eyed about the capitalist world and unwilling to look at its seamier side. Ferociously opposed to the socialist system, they were anti-communist to the point of being full-fledged adulators of Western reactionism. The more rabidly reactionary chic a position was, the more appeal it had for the intelligentsia. With almost religious fervor, intellectuals maintained that the capitalist West, especially the United States, was a free market paradise of superabundance and almost limitless opportunity. Nor would they believe anything to the contrary. With complete certitude, well-fed, university-educated Moscow intellectuals sitting in their modest but comfortable apartments would tell U.S. visitors, "The poorest among you live better than we." A conservative deputy editor of the Wall Street Journal, David Brooks, offers this profile of the Moscow intellectual. Quote, "He is the master of contempt and feels he is living in a world run by imbeciles. He is not unsure, casting about for the correct answers. The immediate answers are obvious: democracy and capitalism. His self-imposed task is to smash the idiots who stand in the way. He has none of the rococo mannerisms of our intellectuals, but values bluntness, rudeness, and arrogance. These democratic intellectuals love Ronald Reagan, Marlboros, and the South in the American Civil War," quoting from National Review 3292. Consider Andrei Sakharov, a darling of the U.S. press, who regularly praised corporate capitalism while belittling the advances achieved by the Soviet people. He lambasted the U.S. peace movement for its opposition to the Vietnam War and accused the Soviets of being military expansionists and the sole culprits behind the arms race. Sakharov supported every U.S. armed intervention abroad as a defense of democracy and characterized new U.S. weapons systems like the neutron bomb as, quote, primarily defensive. Anointed by U.S. leaders and media as a, quote, human rights advocate, he never had an unkind word for the human rights violations perpetrated by the fascist regimes of faithful U.S. client states, including Pinochet's Chile and Suharto's Indonesia, and directed snide remarks toward those who did. He regularly attacked those in the West who dissented from anti-communist orthodoxy and who opposed U.S. interventionism abroad. As with many other Eastern European intellectuals, Sakharov's advocacy of dissent did not extend to opinions that deviated to the left of his own. There's a footnote there. See Andrei Sakharov, My Country and the World, Vintage Books, 1975, especially chapters 3, 4, and 5. A memorable moment was provided me by the noted journalist I.F. Stone in Washington, D.C. in 1987. Izzy, as he was called, had just given a talk at the Institute for Policy Studies, praising Sakharov as a courageous champion of democracy, a portrayal that seemed heavily indebted to the U.S. media image of Sakharov. Encountering Stone in the street after the event, I said to him that we should distinguish between Sakharov's right to speak, which I supported, and the reactionary, CIA-ridden content of his speech, which we were under no obligation to admire. He stopped me in mid-sentence and screamed, "I'm sick and tired of people who wipe the ass of the Soviet Union." Then he stomped away. Izzy Stone was normally a polite man, but as with many on the U.S. left, his anti-Sovietism could cause him to discard both rational discourse and common courtesy. On subsequent occasions, he talked to me in a most friendly manner, but never once thought to apologize for that outburst. Back to the text. The tolerance for Western imperialism extended into the upper reaches of the Soviet government itself, as reflected in a remark made in 1989 by a high-ranking official in the Soviet Foreign Ministry, Andrei Kozyrev, who stated that the Third World countries, quote, suffer not so much from capitalism as from a lack of it. Either by design or stupidity, he confused capital, which those nations lack, with capitalism, of which they have more than enough to victimize them. He also claimed that, quote, none of the main bourgeois groups in America are connected with militarism. Okay. To think of them as imperialists who plunder third world countries is a, quote, stereotyped idea that should be discarded. Quoting the New York Times, January 7, 1989. As a system of analysis mainly concerned with existing capitalism, Marxism has relatively little to say about the development of socialist societies. In the communist countries, Marxism was doled out like a catechism. Its critique of capitalism had no vibrancy or meaning for those who lived in a non-capitalist society. Instead, most intellectuals found excitement in the forbidden fruit of Western bourgeois ideology. In looking to the West, they were not interested in broadening the ideological spectrum, a desirable goal, but in replacing the dominant view with a rightist, anti-communist orthodoxy. They were not for an end to ideology, but for replacing one ideology with another. Without hesitation, they added their voices to the chorus, singing the glories of the free market paradise. Heavily subsidized by Western sources, the right-wing intelligentsia produced publications like Moscow News and Argumentii Fakti, which put out a virulently pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist message. One such publication, Literaturnaya Gazeta, March 1990, hailed Reagan and Bush as, quote, statesmen and, quote, the architects of peace. It questioned the need for a Ministry of Culture in the USSR, even one that was now headed by an anti-communist. Quote, there is no such ministry in the United States, and yet it seems that there is nothing wrong with American culture, unquote. Who said Russians don't have a sense of humor? With the decline of communist power in Eastern Europe, the worst political scum began to float to the surface. Nazi sympathizers and hate groups of all sorts, though they were not the only purveyors of bigotry. In 1990, none other than Polish Solidarity leader Lech Walesa declared that, quote, a gang of Jews had gotten hold of the trough and is bent on destroying us, unquote. Later on, he maintained that the comment did not apply to all Jews, but only those, quote, who are looking out for themselves while not giving a damn about anyone else, unquote. It's from The Nation, September 10, 1990. The following year, in Poland's post-communist presidential election, various candidates, including Walesa, outdid each other in their anti-Semitic allusions. In 1996, at a national ceremony, Solidarity chief Zygmunt Brzodak resorted to anti-Semitic vituperation while railing against the previous communist regime. Quoting New York Times, July 9, 1996. Romanticizing Capitalism. In 1990, in Washington, D.C., the Hungarian ambassador held a press conference to announce that his country was discarding its socialist system because it did not work. When I asked why it did not work, he said, quote, I don't know. Here was someone who confessed that he had no understanding of the deficiencies of his country's socioeconomic process, even though he was one of those in charge of that process. Leaders who talk only to each other are soon out of touch with reality. The policymakers of these communist states showed a surprisingly un-Marxist understanding of the problems they faced. There were denunciations and admonitions aplenty, but little systemic analysis of why and how things had come to such an impasse. Comment there. I think this is one of the reasons why people still wonder this so much today, is because of the lack of kind of, thorough official postmortems, arguably. I mean, and of course, the kind of chaos that emerged out of the destruction of the USSR was not exactly one that was highly conducive to, careful and detailed study. Still, the conversation, it seemed like people quickly moved on, just sort of accepted it didn't work, and that sort of dissection and autopsy, less so. Anyway, continuing. Instead, there was much admiration for what was taken to be Western capitalist know-how and remarkably little understanding of the uglier side of capitalism and how it impacted upon the world. Comment there, this really flies in the face of what was said earlier, which is accurate, that Marxism primarily concerned itself with criticisms of capitalism because that was where the bulk of the fundamental writings were done, was under capitalism. There were speculations about what socialism would be like, but it hadn't been achieved. And, of course, when we're talking about a system, Marxism-Leninism, Lenin died just a few years into the Russian experiment, if you will, So the bulk of these writings were, in fact, about capitalism. Of course, others, Stalin, Mao, many other theoreticians and revolutionaries came later and added to the corpus. But to have, the bulk of policymakers of the communist states not really understanding that capitalism, if you're going to get anything out of Marxism, it's that capitalism does not work and why. But yet the policymakers didn't seem to even have that basic knowledge. Really makes you wonder what exactly was going on over there. Continuing. In the USSR, glasnost, the use of critical debate to invite innovation and reform, opened Soviet media to Western penetration and accelerated the very disaffection it was intended, at least officially, to rectify. Leaders in Poland and Hungary, and eventually the Soviet Union and the other European communist nations, decided to open their economies to Western investment during the late 1980s. It was anticipated that state ownership would exist on equal terms with cooperatives, foreign investors, and domestic private entrepreneurs, citing Washington Post, April 17, 1989. In fact, the whole state economy was put at risk and eventually undermined. Communist leaders had even less understanding of the capitalist system than of their own. Most people living under socialism had little understanding of capitalism in practice. Workers interviewed in Poland believed that if their factory were to be closed down in the transition to the free market, quote, the state will find us some other work, unquote, from the New Yorker, November 1989. They thought that they would have it both ways. In the Soviet Union, many who argued for privatization also expected the government to continue providing them with collective benefits and subsidies. One skeptical farmer got it right, quote, some people want to be capitalists for themselves, but expect socialism to keep serving them, unquote. It's from The Guardian, October 23, 91. Reality sometimes hit home. In 1990, during the glasnost period, when the Soviet government announced that the price of newsprint would be raised 300% to make it commensurate with its actual cost, the new pro-capitalist publications complained bitterly. They were angry that state socialism would no longer subsidize their denunciations of state socialism. They were being subjected to the same free market realities that they so enthusiastically advocated for everyone else, and they did not like it. But not everyone romanticized capitalism. Okay, good to know that at least a few people were still hanging on to Marxism there. Really makes you wonder what was being taught at this point, because honestly, anyway, continuing, many of the Soviet and Eastern European emigres who had migrated to the United States during the 1970s and 80s complained about this country, the United States, poor social services, crime, harsh work conditions, lack of communitarian spirit, I think that's a big one, vulgar electoral campaigns, inferior educational standards, and the astonishing ignorance that Americans had about history. They discovered that they could no longer leave their jobs during the day to go shopping. Oh man. Talk about taking things for granted, I swear. That their employers provided no company doctor when they fell ill on the job, that they were subject to severe reprimands when tardy, that they could not walk the streets and parks late at night without fear, that they might not be able to afford medical services for their family or college tuition for their children, and that they had no guarantee of a job and might experience unemployment at any time. Comment, again, these are just such basic elements of capitalism that have existed throughout capitalism's history. How is this not being discussed on the level where it was common knowledge? Continuing. Among those who never emigrated were some who did not harbor illusions about capitalism. In fact, numerous workers, peasants, and elderly were fearful of the changes ahead and not entirely sold on the free market mythology. A 1989 survey in Czechoslovakia found that 47% wanted their economy to remain state-controlled, while 43% wanted a mixed economy, and only 3% said that they favored capitalism. New York Times, December 1st, 89. Comment, about 3% wanting capitalism. That makes complete sense because that's about what percent of people actually benefit from capitalism. Continuing, in May 1991, a survey of Russians by a U.S. polling organization found that 54% chose some form of socialism, and only 20% wanted a free market economy, such as in the United States or Germany. Another 27% elected for, quote, a modified form of capitalism as found in Sweden, unquote. Monthly Review, 1294. So just a comment there. I mean, you see topics like this come up on LeftTube and, socialist online media, whatever you want to call it. I see some hope, I guess, for the United States as far as maybe possibly actually doing the thing that we need to do, getting rid of capitalism someday. Because, it may be frustrating dealing with all the radlibs and sockdems and, having this lack of cohesion as far as understanding capitalism must be destroyed, and that even social democracy just kind of, exists due to the kind of really violent, hardcore imperialism that the United States does, and then, U.S. allied countries are able to benefit from that while claiming that their system is somehow independent from it, which it's not. It's frustrating having those conversations, and a lot of times it gets framed as how useless the US left is, etc. Although you can easily point out that pretty much all the socialist and communist parties within the imperialist world are not great. Even the former communist countries where it's legal to have a communist party, they're often not great. They're highly revisionist, don't believe in revolution, all the things that people tend to complain about currently. But when you look back at, the 80s in actually socialist countries, that a lot of the people were having these same discussions, and that system was hanging by a thread at that point. In other words, I guess at the end, they weren't so different from the way that we are today in terms of just where the people's thinking was at. And I do think that this can be remedied by education and just relentlessly rubbing people's face in material conditions, not allowing people to attain false consciousness. But, I guess that there's a point that you cross where people, people talk about learned helplessness. I don't think that that's from looking at bad conditions, because you can take bad conditions and recast them as we can do better than this. I mean, that's directly, attacking the mindset of learned helplessness. But anyway, it's just interesting to see that the same kinds of conversations, which can be so frustrating today, were being had in some of these, now formerly socialist countries. But I guess that also goes to show that's where it gets you, to a formerly socialist country. Continuing, still, substantial numbers, especially among intellectuals and youths, the two groups who know everything, that's funny, opted for the free market paradise without the faintest notion of its social costs. And comment again, just how did this happen? Against the inflated imagination, reality is a poor thing. Against the glittering image of the West's cornucopia, the routinized, scarcity-ridden, and often exasperating experiences of communist society didn't have a chance. It seems that communism created a dialectical dynamic that undermined itself. It took semi-feudal, devastated, underdeveloped countries and successfully industrialized them, bringing a better life for most. But this very process of modernization and uplift also created expectations that couldn't be fulfilled. Many expected to keep all the securities of socialism, overlaid with capitalist consumerism. As we will see in subsequent chapters, they were in for some painful surprises. So to comment there again, I'm commenting more now, having digested more of the chapter. Obviously, we're near the end of it. I think that you could say the same thing for the much less socialistic, but still more socialistic than today. And yeah, I don't usually use the word socialistic, but prior to neoliberalism in the late 70s into the 80s and then deepening up to today, we had the golden age of social democracy, right? The New Deal, 1930s to the mid-1970s. We'll say 35 to 75, thereabouts. Obviously at different stages of it at different times. But you could say that a similar thing happened in the United States. It was never even close to full socialism. But even the limited kinds of social democracy and, a stronger labor movement when that was a thing back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on, I think that a lot of people took that for granted here and sort of expected that all those securities were just there for good, that it wasn't like a transient thing that if people stopped fighting for them, they would be lost. And that you could just add capitalist consumerism with it and sort of start thinking really individualistically, and, that wouldn't cost the working class anything. And obviously it did, because we got into the Reagan years and all that, and then the entire social safety net is no longer really a functioning safety net, et cetera, et cetera. So this kind of ideological slackening, this complacency, it looks like it cost the working class the whole world over quite a bit. Continuing. One reason siege socialism couldn't make the transition to consumer socialism is that the state of siege was never lifted. As noted in the previous chapter, the very real internal deficiencies within communist systems were exacerbated by unrelenting external attacks and threats from the Western powers. Born into a powerfully hostile capitalist world, communist nations suffered through wars, invasions, and an arms race that exhausted their productive capacities and held back their development. The decision by Soviet leaders to achieve military parity with the United States, while working from a much smaller industrial base, placed a serious strain on the entire Soviet economy. The very siege socialism that allowed the USSR to survive made it difficult for it to thrive. I would comment, under later changed conditions. Perestroika, or the restructuring of socioeconomic practices in order to improve performance, was intended, at least officially, to open and revitalize production. Instead, it led to the unraveling of the entire state socialist fabric. Thus, the pluralistic media that were to replace the communist monopoly media eventually devolved into a pro-capitalist ideological monopoly. The same thing happened to other socialist institutions. The intent was to use a shot of capitalism to bolster socialism. Comment, that is not how that works. And, when I keep saying that was at least the official intention, I say that because we know that there was also sabotage and espionage going on, and you just wonder how much of this was legit, because, you can read 3 books by Marx and understand that that's not how it works. Anyway, continuing. The reality was that socialism was used to subsidize and build an unforgiving capitalism. Comment, I think that's an excellent point, actually, because really, it's like all the sacrifices that were made during socialism for the revolution and to build the new society, capitalism really came in when it was nice and ripe and just plucked it off the tree and ate it. And that's pretty much the situation we're in now. Continuing, pressed hard throughout its history by global capitalism's powerful financial, economic, and military forces, state socialism endured a perpetually tenuous existence, only to be swept away when the floodgates were opened to the West. So that's the end of chapter 4, and the next chapter concerns more things about the post-communist period and sort of excavating Soviet history. But I want to add, in closing on this chapter, I think that chapters 3 and 4 are nicely complementary as far as the overall subject of taking socialist revolution and all those struggles for granted. You could say that chapter 3 was taking it all for granted and not properly valuing it in the overall context of what they were coming out of, the kind of capitalist and feudalist oppression that the USSR countries were fighting their way out of, and what was to come during neoliberalism after all this was destroyed and came crashing down. That it was that period of blackest reaction that Stalin once talked about. Whether it was the chapter 3 situation of the Western left that was anti-communist, anti-Soviet, and we can do socialism some different way. Okay, what are you waiting for? Oh, you're not actually doing it, you're just sort of complacent with the capitalist order. Meanwhile, the Soviets were actually doing it, and chapter 4 is kind of about complacency and thinking that the whole thing was just going to last forever, even if it was run badly, and taking it for granted from within the system. This was just a gigantic error on the part of the whole working class, both in the Western imperialist countries and within the communist countries. That, oh, these gains are permanent. They're just going to be around forever. We can never slide backwards. Not really, not substantially. And look at where we are today in both areas. The imperialist world is way more rapacious, way worse. People are just struggling to get off the ground at all. People, born in the last couple of decades, just having an extremely difficult time, unless they were born rich, because the growing wealth inequality. If you were born not rich, your odds of making it are just slimmer and slimmer, your prospects dimmer and dimmer. And, it was like once thought that this base of economic rights, won in the first half of the 20th century, was just going to be around forever. But by the end of the 20th century, a lot of it had crumbled and been destroyed, except in a very few countries. And even those countries, for example, China, they have had to allow a lot more capitalism in their country than anybody ever thought. And some people don't call it socialist at all anymore. But, how do we get back to the thing that we lost that wasn't properly cared for? I guess that's one way to look at this whole thing. So, just a couple of other comments on this book as a whole up to this point from some of the feedback that people have given. One of the biggest criticisms of this book is that Parenti didn't use enough academic sources, that he relies too heavily on newspaper and magazine quotations and things like that. I think that there are a few places where that's true. However, he does use a variety of sources. This chapter in particular, I thought, went a little too heavily on, newspaper quotations and things like that. Whereas, he maybe could have gone for sources that were a bit more rigorous and reliable and all that kind of thing. I don't know why he did that. But the extent to which people criticize this book for that, first of all, those aren't the only sources that he uses. In the earlier chapters, he cited a whole slew of books. But to the extent that, I think that that's a valid criticism, I would just counter with, this book, cover to cover, like including the covers, is less than 200 pages long. I don't think that this book was ever intended to be like the be-all, end-all, like the final word in this discussion. It's a popular book. It was intended to popularize these views. And to that extent, I think that a lot of the citations are pretty appropriate. Now, if people have more substantive criticism, such as that specifically the kinds of views and the quotations that he's using in the book are incorrect, like if you want to say that his conclusions and the overall narrative is wrong because the things that he's citing are like factually inaccurate or misleading or whatever, then I would say make that claim. Otherwise, this isn't like a 400-page, intensely academic book. It's intended to be popular. And so if you think something's inaccurate, then say that. But anyway, I mean, this chapter was obviously very critical of what went wrong, or, what was wrong with the USSR and Eastern European countries' systems, the inefficiency. And I mean, I've heard stories of like, because heat was free in the big, housing project, people just run the heat, and then in the winter, they'd sometimes like open their windows to cool it off instead of like turning the heat off. Okay, that's wasteful. But to the extent that what Parenti has said here about the system and its flaws is accurate, factually accurate, I mean, to a certain extent, it's value choice. I mean, would you rather have that, or would you rather have the US type system, which was once held in check by this other system, by its mere existence, and then after the socialist system largely fell apart. I mean, there are still some beacons of it today to some extent, but when the biggest exemplars of it, fell by the wayside, what did the US turn into? It's a full-on nightmare now. So you can say that this tendency was dormant, latent the whole time, and that the existence of the socialist country, like the particularly European bloc and all that, held it at bay. So I mean, I think that there's tremendous virtue just to that point. I'm not saying that some of what he's describing wouldn't have been annoying, but having annoyances in your life versus, I don't know, being homeless, there are big problems in the West today that I really wish, somebody had gone back like with a time machine and showed, hey, here's what 2020 is going to be like. You don't get to have it both ways. In fact, if anyone paid attention to Marx at all, you would know that. Capitalism runs on very simple logic, and you can't just have it both ways. This whole, I want a mixed economy. Your mixed economy winds up being 95% capitalism. That's the mix. Unless you have extremely strict controls on it at the top, as China arguably does. Whether they're able to hang on to whatever control they have, time will tell. But, that would be the only circumstance where you can allow some kind of a capitalist, market sector to exist, is under that extremely strict political control. Because otherwise, what does capital do? It expands, takes things over, sucks everything into doing business on its terms. That's just the way it works. Again, read 3 or 4 books by Marx. You'll get this quickly. It's basic. So anyway, I said before it's about value judgments. Which is better? Which would you prefer? However, the conversation doesn't have to end there, because I think, as Parenti accurately pointed out, there were many cases where there were just structural incentives for the kinds of outcomes that happened to happen. And arguably policymakers who are more in touch with those situations, if there was more of a culture of discussion of those problems and more of an active, ongoing fine-tuning of policy to ensure that, if some kind of dysfunctional, counterproductive situation was building up, that you could change the incentives so as to correct it. Parenti argues that that was not being done, that, for example, computerization wasn't used to improve the calculation methods. Now, we know that in China today, they have adopted those things, and they have avoided some of the outcomes of the USSR by making, those kinds of adaptations. So, good for China. The USSR didn't, and if they had made more of them, they might have avoided complete system failure, as they/we experienced. Because again, this was, of course, devastating the people who lived in those countries. It also, the existence of those countries lifted the standards for the entire world, and the standards fell when those countries fell. So just one more closing thought, I guess. In the discussions of when the USSR, got on its feet and was doing its thing, and then it turned out a lot of people didn't want to work. That's actually not hugely surprising to me. That people would only want to work 4 or 6 hours a day. Yeah, if you have the option to work 4 or 6 hours a day versus like 8 or 9, wouldn't you take the 4 or 6? I guess there's going to be some people who just are in such a groove with whatever their job is that they're just going to love it. And that's fine. Nobody's trying to hold those people back. But shouldn't lowering the number of working hours in a day be one of the goals? For probably the majority of the population, at least, who probably want it. In other words, you give people the opportunity to run their own economy. And I don't find it hugely surprising that most people are not running their own economy in such a way that leaves them burnt out and fatigued every day, as working 8 or 9 hours a day definitely does for most people, depending on what you do, again, in your relationship to it. But that's not hugely surprising. So I don't necessarily consider that a flaw or drawback in and of itself. But you do want to make sure that it doesn't contribute to any kind of, death spirals in your economy. And that's where, the hand of the planners and policymakers really needs to stay on the ball. In other words, yeah, in an economic democracy, people are going to work as much as they want to work, which probably isn't going to be 40 hours a week. At the same time, somebody needs to make sure that the entire system doesn't have creeping systemic failure. And they need the power to make sure that that doesn't happen, because what happens then? decades of misery, reaction, exactly what is happening now. So anyway, I thought that this was a very interesting chapter. It starts off a bit bleak, but I think that it raises some good questions, and had more of these discussions happened at the time, again, maybe on both sides of this, the inside and the outside of those now fallen socialist countries, maybe we all wouldn't have taken this thing so much for granted, and now find ourselves in a situation in 2022 scrambling to get into something better again because the outcomes have just been so bleak. And in the US, really rapidly worsening. Anyway, we'll leave it there for now. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll pick it up there as always. Otherwise, more installments coming soon, and thanks for listening. Thanks also to the current patrons, whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, that would be much appreciated. You can sign up at patreon.com/socialismforall for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. Every donation is encouraging. They are also materially helpful, so thank you very much. If you like this channel, thank me, of course. I'm the one who actually recorded the stuff. But thank a patron too, because their support has enabled me to spend a lot more time producing this content than I would have been able to do without their support. So thank you very much. Also, thanks to everyone who has been liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting on the channel. All of that interaction and sharing helps more people to see the content, expands the audience, boosts the videos in the YouTube algorithm, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to do Marxism education here, both in terms of the history and theory, and apply it to trying to think about solving some current political problems. Along those lines, join an organization out in the real world, because all the agitation, education in the world is only going to get you so far. You also have to do the third part, which is organization. See what's available in your community, inquire of the people who are currently in it, try to find out everything that you can. And I would say look for something ideally larger rather than smaller, although do what you can. Also something that's healthy in terms of they respond quickly to inquiries, that the people get along, that there's not bitter infighting, people quitting, getting burned out, things like that. Being in a good org can be really good. Being in a bad org can be life-shattering. Something that also ideally has real ties to the community, is working on real projects that tangibly affect people's lives in the community, rather than, if you're just looking for a book club, you can find that online. But do get out there, meet people in the left community where you live, network, and see what you can get going. Whatever the size of it today, it may grow in the future, and it's worth meeting the people, and who knows, maybe a new project will come out of it that you don't foresee at all at the present time. Anyway, thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next video.